Tragedy and Hope, Carol Quigley. Chapter 21. The Period of Deflation, 1927 to 1936. The period of stabilization cannot be clearly distinguished from the period of deflation. In most countries, the period of deflation began in 1921 and after about 4 or 5 years became more rapid in its development, reaching after 1929 a degree which could be called acute. Finance, commercial policy, business activity. In the first part of this period, 1921 to 1925, the dangerous economic implications of deflation were concealed by a structure of self-deception which pretended that a great period of economic progress would be inaugurated as soon as the task of stabilization had been accomplished. This psychological optimism was completely unwarranted by the economic facts, even in the United States, where these economic facts were, for the short term at least, more promising than anywhere else. After 1925, when the deflation became more deep-rooted and economic conditions worsened, the danger from these conditions was concealed by a continuation of unwarranted optimism. The chief symptom of the unsoundness of the underlying economic reality, the steady fall in prices, was concealed in the later period, 1925 to 1929, by a steady rise in security prices, which was erroneously regarded as a good sign, and by the excessive lending abroad of the United States, which amounted to almost $10 billion in the period 1920 to 1931, bringing our total foreign investment to almost $27 billion by the end of 1930. This foreign lending of the United States was the chief reason why the maladjusted economic conditions could be kept concealed for so many years. Before the World War, the United States had been a debtor nation, and to pay these debts had developed an exporting economy. The combination of debtor and exporter is a feasible one. The war made the United States a creditor nation and also made her a greater exporter than ever by building up her acreage of cotton and wheat and her capacity to produce ships, steel, textiles, and so on. The resulting combination of creditor and exporter was not feasible. The United States refused to accept either necessary alternative, to reduce debts owed to her or to increase her imports. Instead, she raised tariffs against imports and temporarily filled the gap with huge foreign loans. But this was hopeless as a permanent solution. As a temporary solution, it permitted the United States to be both creditor and exporter. It permitted Germany to pay reparations with neither a budgetary surplus nor a favorable balance of trade. It permitted dozens of minor countries to adopt a gold standard they could not hold. It permitted France, Britain, Italy, and others to pay war debts to the United States without sending goods. In a word, it permitted the world to live in a fairyland of self-delusions, remote from economic realities. These realities were characterized by a. Fundamental maladjustments, both economic and financial, which made it impossible for the financial system to function as it had in 1914, and b. The steady deflation. The fundamental maladjustments were both economic and financial. The economic maladjustments were those which we have already indicated, the industrialization of colonial eras. The overproduction of raw materials and food as a result of wartime high prices. The overexpansion of heavy industry as a result of wartime needs. The obsolescence of much of heavy industry in Europe and in Britain, which made it impossible to compete with newer equipment or to cope with a shift in consumer demand, and the steadily increasing disadvantage of producers of raw materials and food, in contrast with producers of industrial goods. To these old factors were added new ones, such as the great increase in productive efficiency in Germany and the United States, the return of Russia and Germany to the European economy about 1924, and the return of Europe to the world economy in the period 1925 to 1927. Many countries sought to resist these factors, both old and new, by adopting political interference with economic life in the form of tariffs, import quotas, export subsidies, and so on. The financial maladjustment served to create an insufficiency of gold and a maldistribution of gold. The inadequacy of the supply of gold arose from several causes. It has been estimated that the world's stock of gold money needed to increase by 3.1% per year in the 1920s to support the world's economic development with stable prices on the gold standard. The production of new gold after 1920 was below this rate. Moreover, as a result of the activities of the League of Nations and financial advisors like Professor E. W. Kammerer of Princeton University, every country was encouraged to get on the gold standard. This led to a gold rush, as each country tried to obtain a supply of gold large enough to provide adequate reserves. Because there were more countries on gold in 1928 than in 1914, and because prices in general were higher, more gold was needed in reserves. The efforts to get around this by using a gold exchange standard rather than a gold standard were helpful in dealing with the problem of inadequate supplies of gold, but increased the difficulty of the problem of maldistribution of gold, since the gold exchange standard did not respond to the flow of gold as readily, and thus did not serve so well to stem such flows of gold. The need for gold was made greater by the existence of large floating balances of political or panic funds, which might well move from one market to another, independent of economic conditions. The need was increased by the fact that in 1920 there were three major financial centers which had to make payments by shipments of gold, in contrast to the single financial center of 1914, where payments could be made by bookkeeping transactions. To rectify this problem to some degree, the Bank for International Settlements was created in 1929, but never functioned as its founders had hoped. Finally, the need for gold was increased by the enormous growth in foreign indebtedness, much of it of a political nature, such as the war debts and reparations. On top of this insufficiency of gold was superimposed a drastic maldistribution of gold. This was conclusive proof that the financial system of 1914 had broken down, for the old system would have operated automatically to distribute gold evenly. This maldistribution resulted from the fact that when gold flowed into certain countries, the automatic results of such a flow, such as rising prices or falling interest rates, would have restored equilibrium in 1914, were prevented from acting in 1928. In this period, about 4/5 of the world's gold supply was in 5 countries, and over half was in two, the United States and France. The gold had been brought to these two for quite different reasons. To the United States because it was the world's greatest creditor, and to France because of its devaluation of the franc. Britain, on the other hand, had floating balances of about £800 million, and handled each year 20,000 million pounds in transactions with a gold reserve of only £150 million. Such a situation made it possible for France to use gold as a political weapon against Britain. As a result of these conditions and the deflationary economic conditions described in Chapter 11, prices began to fall, at first slowly and then with increasing rapidity. The turning point in most countries was in 1925 to 1926, with Great Britain one of the earliest, January 1925. In the first half of 1929, this slow drift downward began to change to a rapid drop. The following table will show the changes in wholesale prices for 5 principal countries. Now we have a table where wholesale prices is like 100 in 1913, and then we have United States. For example, in 1937 it was 124, in Britain it was 114, in France it was 581, in Italy it was 449, in Germany it was 106. So compared to 1914. The economic effects of these soft prices after 1925 were adverse. But these effects were concealed for a considerable period because of various influences, especially the liberal credit policies of the United States, both foreign and domestic, and the optimism engendered by the stock market boom. The facade of prosperity over unsound economic conditions was practically worldwide. Only in France and the United States it was a boom in real wealth, but in the latter it was by no means as great as one might think from a glance at stock prices. In Britain, the boom appeared in the form of the flotation of new stocks of unsound and fraudulent companies, and a minor stock market boom, about 1/3 as fast a rise in security prices as in the United States. In Germany and in much of Latin America, the boom was based upon foreign borrowing, chiefly from the United States, the proceeds of which were largely put into non-productive construction. In Italy, held down by the over-evaluation of the lira in 1927, the boom was of short duration. The crash of 1929. The history of the slump begins about 1927, when France stabilized the franc de facto at a level at which it was devalued and undervalued. This led to a great demand for francs. The Bank of France sold francs in return for foreign exchange. The francs were created as credit in France, thus giving an inflationary effect which can be seen in the behavior of French prices in 1926 to 1928. The foreign exchange which France received for its francs was largely left in that form without being converted into gold. By 1928, the Bank of France found that it held foreign exchange to the value of 32 billion francs, about $1.2 billion. At this point, the Bank of France began to transfer its exchange holdings into gold. buying the metal chiefly in London and New York. Because of the inadequate gold reserves in London, a meeting of central bankers in New York decided that the gold purchases of France and Germany should be diverted from London to New York in the future, July 1927. To prevent the resulting outflow of gold from having a deflationary effect which might injure business, the New York Federal Reserve Bank dropped its discount rate from 4% to 3.5%. When the French gold purchases became noticeable in 1928, the Federal Reserve Bank adopted open market operations to counterbalance them, buying securities to a value equal to the French purchases of gold. As a result, there was no reduction in money in the United States. This money, however, was going increasingly into stock market speculation rather than into production of real wealth. This can be seen from the following table of indices of average stock prices for both England and the United States in the years indicated. So we have a table. Industrial shares prices in 1924 were 100. So in the United Kingdom we have in 1924 100, in 1929 139, but then fell to 87 and it was 125 in 1934. In the United States, 100 in 1924 grows to 270 in 1929, then falls to 66 in 1932 when Roosevelt was elected, and then it's 116 in 1934. The stock market boom in the United States was really much more drastic than is indicated by these index numbers, because these are yearly averages and include sluggish stocks as well as market leaders. The boom began as far back as 1924, as can be seen, and reached its peak in the fall of 1929. By the spring of 1929 it had become a frenzy and was having profound effects on business activity, on domestic and international finance, on the domestic affairs of foreign countries, and on the psychology and modes of life of Americans. Among the financial results of the stock market boom were the following. In the United States, credit was diverted from production to speculation, and increasing amounts of funds were being drained from the economic system into the stock market, where they circulated around and around, building up the prices of securities. In Germany, it became increasingly difficult to borrow from the United States, and the foreign loans, which kept the German financial system and the whole system of reparations and war debts functioning, were shifted from long-term loans to precarious short-term credits. The results of this have been examined in the chapter on reparations. In other countries, funds tended to flow to the United States, where they could expect to roll up extraordinary earnings in capital gains in a relatively short time. This was especially true of funds from Britain, where the stock market boom ceased after the end of 1928. By that time, the fundamentally unsound economic conditions were beginning to break through the facade. The decline in foreign loans by both London and New York began to be noticeable by the last half of 1928 and made it evident that the chief support of the facade was vanishing. But the continued rise of security prices in New York continued to draw money from the rest of the world and from the productive and consumptive systems of the United States itself. Early in 1929, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System became alarmed at the stock market speculation, especially as it's draining credit from industrial production.